I used to hate The Legend of Zelda for the Nintendo Entertainment System. I'm not kidding. For a long time, I genuinely thought playing the game was an awful experience. I simply could not enjoy myself. I pick it up, play about half of it, put it down, never touch it again, and the cycle has repeated for multiple years. But then suddenly, during one of my playthroughs, something clicked. I was suddenly having fun? I was having a lot of fun actually, and despite there still being parts of the game that annoyed me, my opinion as a whole raised considerably. This is confusing. I mean, the game never changed, all of the problems that I had with the game are still there, just my feelings towards them have changed. It just does not make any sense. What exactly happened here? Well, I think I know. Zelda 1's opening is simultaneously its biggest strength and weakness. On the positive side, you can go wherever you want, do whatever you want in any order, decide to go straight to the dungeon or take the time to prepare beforehand, collecting items and upgrades to get stronger. If you know what you're doing, you'll have a decent chunk of health, an upgraded tunic, an upgraded sword, and even some items before even entering the first dungeon. On the other side of the coin, where do I go? You are dropped into the middle of the game without any direction or guidance. And when I say no guidance, I'm not talking about a waypoint or anything like that. No. I mean no guidance. You will most likely stumble into either the first or the second dungeon with only 3 hearts and a wooden sword, die over and over again, get frustrated, and quit the game. Of course there were going to be people who can just brute force this and skill their way out of it, but they will encounter problems that will be discussed later. From this point onwards, I want to talk about the game completely in order, so let's go into the beginning a little bit more in depth. You start the game without a sword, but on the starting screen there is a very visible cave that contains it. This is a really good start, as most people are going to see the cave door, which looks visually different than every other exit, and be attracted to it. And if they don't and they leave without their sword, they're not going to be blindsided that the sword is in there. There is a cave on the starting screen. Of course there's going to be something important in there. Our first step in preparation is to get some bombs. The easiest way to do this is just to go right and kill some blue Octoroks. Alternatively, you could just buy them from the shop. Now that we have some bombs, we can go get some heart containers. Yeah, entire containers, as heart pieces just haven't been invented yet. So we actually just need to go back to this beach and bomb this wall. How were you supposed to know that? No, I'm serious, this tile looks the exact same as all the other wall tiles, and you wouldn't even know bombable walls are even a thing as there is no teaching moment for them. You have zero reason to even suspect that they exist. And this is Zelda 1's biggest problem. It is too primitive for you to figure everything out without any guidance. You need guidance to beat Zelda 1. And while that isn't entirely the game's fault, it is an incredibly big problem for people trying to play the game for the first time. I'm somebody who will look up a solution online if I get stuck in a video game, and I'm not ashamed to admit that. Beating my head over a brick wall over and over again when I just can't figure out the solution is just frustrating and is a waste of my time. However, it is a last resort, as figuring out puzzles is a really fun experience that I don't like ruining for myself. A big part of the way I feel towards games I get stuck in is how I react after finding the solution online. Let me show you what I mean with a later Zelda game. In Ocarina of Time, there was this wall in the Fire Temple. This wall is indeed bombable, but looks the exact same as all the other walls around it. Sound familiar? The difference here is that Ocarina gives you other hints as to where this wall is. The first is the Skulltula noise. It clearly lets you know that one is around, prompting you to look for it. The second hint, well, I'll just show you. This doesn't seem right. Bingo! The game leads you right to it. First, prompting you to look for it, then giving you a way to identify where it is. If I find this myself, I feel accomplished for being observant. If I had to look up the solution online, the way to find it makes sense. The solution isn't BS, I just didn't think of it. This is what I consider to be the bare minimum in good design. Every tool you need to solve the puzzle is in the game itself. Now let's see what tools are in Zelda 1 to locate where this cave is. Yep, there are none. If I found this myself, I would be surprised, maybe even a little happy, but not accomplished. I did not use any skills to find this. I just placed a bomb down in a random spot and it happened to work. On the flip side, if I had to look this up, I would just be asking myself, how was I supposed to know that? I wouldn't fault myself. There was no natural way for me to figure that out. Now let me be clear here that I do not blame Zelda 1 for this. I don't think Zelda 1 is an objectively bad game because of this issue. How do you even avoid this? It's 30-year-old design. And when it was released, it was amazing. I'm pretty confident they could not even fix this issue even if they had future knowledge. Zelda 1 is already a massive game for the NES. Would they even technically be able to fix this? It's nobody's fault it's like this. It's just aged. And this is why I don't want anybody to disrespect Zelda 1 just because it was designed like this. It's a product of its time. That being said, it has definitely not held up and is a massive issue for the general enjoyment of newer players. There are numerous items, puzzles, and even dungeon locations that bring up the question of, how was I supposed to know that? So I will be silently keeping count in the top right corner whenever something like this happens. After entering the hole in the wall, you get a choice between a heart container and a potion. I hope you pick the heart container because this is a permanent decision, and picking the potion locks you out of that heart container forever. Breath of the Wild did something similar with its stamina vessels, but in that game it's handled much better with the stamina vessels being both more useful and, more importantly, permanent. The proper choice here is a no-brainer. You either get a permanent health upgrade that can be filled up naturally with hearts or fairies, or you get an item that can fully heal you, yes, but as a result you will have less hearts to heal, and you can already buy it anyway. If you pick the potion, you aren't choosing an alternative playstyle, you're shooting yourself in the foot. On our way to the second heart container, we see another heart container that we can't yet obtain. Remember this one, I actually like it a lot. Our second heart container is on this screen. This bombable wall is actually quite a bit better than the beach one, as this rock placement is pretty suspicious. There's still no indication on where to actually bomb though, so if you bomb the left side and assume nothing was there, too bad I guess. Our next step is to obtain some money as we need a lot of it. The easiest way to do this is to utilize the game's various secrets. You may argue that the secrets aren't required to beat the game, or 100% it even, but grinding for money in this game is just a terrible experience, so if you want to have fun, yes it is. First one is just this bombable wall here. This one isn't too bad actually, you could reasonably guess that there's something here. But the next secret is just walking through a wall! Yeah! We can use this newfound money to just buy a blue candle, which is a pretty useful item that we will just be using to get other secrets later. Finally, we pick up the white sword, which is just sitting here in this cave. So here's the thing, if you do not have 5 hearts, you cannot pick up the white sword, and this is not communicated to you at all. And you won't have 5 hearts unless you find those 2 bombable walls, which you wouldn't know are there. Yikes, it's gonna lead to you finding this sword, trying to pick it up, and the game not letting you, and you having no idea why. Now that all of our preparations are done, it's time to head to Dungeon 1. You could technically get more gear by this point, but you would have to go out of your way for it. Dungeons in Zelda 1 are held back by the visuals. All dungeons look the same except for the color, and most rooms look identical. This isn't the game's fault, as I'm sure this is the best that they could do, but it's not doing the game any favors either. The design of the dungeons are also fundamentally different than most Zelda games. You get a dungeon item, get a map and compass, and beat a boss. That much is the same, but there was little to no actual puzzles in the dungeons except for pushing a block every now and then and blowing up a wall. Instead, the main challenge comes from navigating its maze-like structure and the combat. The relationship the dungeons have with keys are also completely different. In later Zelda games, if you get a key, you are usually expected to use it on a certain door to progress. Additionally, after leaving the dungeon, your key count goes back to 0. This is to stop you from skipping half of the next dungeon. This is not the case in Zelda 1. You are free to keep your keys in between dungeons. In fact, I think you can even buy them from shops. The trade-off for this is that there is a lot of locked doors in this game, and a lot of them are completely useless. Because of this, on your first playthrough, I would honestly recommend having a full map of the dungeon to avoid wasting your keys like this. The first dungeon is really simple, and that is by no means a bad thing. You just go in, kill some enemies for keys, and then you finally reach a branching path. Go up and get the dungeon item, or go to the right and kill the boss. This is kind of a strange thing about Zelda 1. You very rarely ever need the dungeon item to beat the dungeon. Said dungeon item is the bow, which does nothing! Yeah! If you have obtained the white sword, then the boss goes down in just 3 hits. If not, then the fight's a little harder, but by no means impossible. After dungeon 1, it's time to collect some stuff! The first is some rupees from this bush that you need to know to burn with the candle, except for the fact that you won't even know that the candle can burn bushes, as if you try the candle on the bush that does not hide a secret, it doesn't react at all. But at least this bush is in the corner, so it's a little obvious to try. Just like this one that's randomly 5 bushes from the right of the screen! Obvious, right? Moving on to Dungeon 2, it's a considerable step down in terms of difficulty. The way to beat the dungeon is literally just you go right and then up. And that's it, that's the layout, not exactly complex. The boss isn't really difficult at all either, it's just one singular Dodongo. Although the mechanics of the Dodongos in this game are kind of interesting. In Zelda 1, to kill a Dodongo you need to feed it bombs. This is pretty common Zelda knowledge. What is not common knowledge though is that you can actually stun them with the smoke from the bomb, and if you hit them in the face with the sword when they're stunned, they die instantly and give you a guaranteed bomb drop. That's extremely small, but it's really cool. And now it's collection time again. There's a secret under the statue for 30, and then you just gotta grind until you have 250 rupees. The next item we're collecting is actually on the path to the 3rd dungeon. This is something that I've noticed with the design of Zelda 1's overworld. There tends to be a string of secrets and collectibles leading to each dungeon, and I can't help but think that this is entirely purposeful. We have gotten all those rupees to buy the most expensive item in the game, the blue ring, which is just in this secret shop that you're totally gonna naturally find. The 3rd dungeon is a proper step up. The layout is more complex, but it also introduces the Dark Nut, one of the more annoying enemies, but I've actually grown to really like them. Sure, they are difficult, but they are fair. You can only hit them from the side or the back. The problem? Well, they're constantly moving, they have a decent amount of health, and they hit really hard. This is by far one of the most dangerous enemies in the game, and that's a good thing. It creates tense moments. You walk into a room full of these things, and you start to panic. It is excellent for enemy variety. The dungeon item is the raft, which doesn't do anything now, but will really soon. The boss of Dungeon 3 is also really cool, as there is actually 2 ways to kill him. You can just stab his heads, but every single time he loses 1 head, he gets faster, effectively making him harder to kill. Or you could place a really well-timed bomb in the middle and blow up all 4 heads at once, instantly killing him. This is perfect. It rewards you for thinking to use your items while not brick walling you for not. And even though the bomb does one-shot him, it's not free as the bomb needs to be really well timed. Overall, I feel like Dungeon 3 is one of the better dungeons in the game. Time spent between 3 and 4 is actually really short. Remember how we're broke now because we spent literally all of our money on the blue ring? Well, it turns out there's a secret for 100 rupees just lying around right close to here. And on top of that, you can buy discounted meat in the shop nearby. Why do you want to buy the meat? Just do it. And Dungeon 4 is right nearby, with you needing to walk into this dock to use your raft. The dungeon starts normally enough until you reach a door you can't get to yet, so you are actually required to get the dungeon item to progress through this dungeon. I believe this is the first instance of something like this happening in Zelda 1. On the way to get the item, you see this room. Remember this room right here, its placement is brilliant. Oh look, the item's a ladder. I wonder what it does. Well, the only thing we can do right now is oh, that's what it does. It lets you cross 1-tile gaps you otherwise couldn't have. And this room right here is a trap for you to walk into as a player. You are put into a situation where you are extremely likely to accidentally step on a water tile, effectively learning what the ladder does. I wish more of Zelda 1 was like this. The boss of Dungeon 4 is also my favorite in the game, even though it does tend to kill me way too much. The fight on paper is really simple. Hit his heads while dodging his projectiles. But in practice, this creates a satisfying dance of trying to be constantly moving while also landing your blows. Once you destroy one of his heads, they start flying around the room firing projectiles at you, effectively making the fight even more tense as he gets closer to death. I would honestly say that Dungeon 4 is the most Zelda dungeon in Zelda 1. The 5th dungeon is on the right side of the map. You want to know what else is on the right side of the map? That heart container we couldn't get earlier. And now we have an item that allows us to collect it. So let's just make our way there, and what's this? A dock? Oh look! Boom! It leads to another heart container. This is genuinely genius. You see this heart container earlier, it sticks in your mind because you don't know how to collect it, and you just got the ladder from a dungeon that requires you to know how the raft works to even enter it. Either on your way to this heart container, or directly after collecting it, you are very likely to find this dock leading you to a second one. And on top of that, the 5th dungeon is nearby. This is near perfect world design, and there was no way it was accidental. But then they messed it all up by making the 5th dungeon stupid to find. If you stumbled around the area, you're eventually gonna find this screen that seems to be looping, and you just keep going up. And boom, there's the dungeon. This marks the end of my favorite part of Zelda 1. Spawning in with nothing and using your knowledge of the game to collect your upgrades one by one is an incredibly satisfying experience. One you won't get on your first playthrough. The way the game spaces out its secrets and items is extremely smart, and you tend to be able to get everything you would realistically need on the way to the dungeon. A good example of this is Dungeon 3. Dungeon 3 introduces harder enemies. On the way to Dungeon 3, you get the opportunity to buy the blue ring, which doubles your defense. The dungeon creates a problem, and there is a solution on the way. The game feels like an adventure in the first half. It feels like you're Link, an unstoppable force wiping the floor with anything Ganon throws at him, collecting any tool or weapons you need along the way. You are in a constant loop of collection, challenge, collection, challenge, collection, challenge, and this dungeon breaks that loop for the most part. There are still some things to collect, but it doesn't seem nearly as thought out or plentiful as before. From this point on, it's almost all dungeons. I don't like Dungeon 5 very much. What's my problem with it? I actually have 3. The first is the boss. The only way to kill him is to play the recorder you find in this dungeon. How do you know how to do that? I don't know. Problem 2. The recorder that you need to kill him is just behind a random bombable wall. And problem 3. This dungeon introduces blue dark nuts. Blue dark nuts are essentially just the normal ones, but with way more health. This makes them extremely deadly, as normal dark nuts are already really hard to take out. There is a solution to this, and it actually is accessible to you, but it's on the other side of the map. So, Dungeon 5 requires you to randomly use an item on the boss, has said item locked behind a bombable wall, and breaks the string of convenient item placement. As I mentioned earlier, the collection pieces of the game are a lot weaker now. For a Dungeon 6 setup, you literally just go to the left and you pick up the power bracelet, which is probably one of the most useless items in the game, and then you also pick up the magical sword, which is the strongest sword. I would argue that it's a very important item. It's under just a random gravestone, in an area where there's like 6 screens full of gravestones, when you wouldn't know that you can even move gravestones? Dungeon 6 is basically just annoying for introducing Wizrobes, which is just the worst enemy. They pretty much hit as hard as the Dark Nuts, except they have a ranged attack. The counter to this is a magical shield that you have to buy in the shop that, you know, just looks like your normal shield. The likes here can also just take away your magical shield, so if you lose it, well, you're gonna have an even worse time. The mini boss of this place is pretty cool, and the main boss is so wait, how do I kill? Oh yeah, you need the bow! Oh wait, but the bow actually does nothing because you actually had to go out and buy arrows for your bow. You know, those arrows in the shop that just look like a refill if you played any other Zelda game? If you actually have the bow and arrow though, then Gohma's a one-shot kill. Super easy boss. But let me stress just how annoying this is. In Ocarina of Time, if you get a slingshot in a dungeon, you are expected to use the slingshot in that dungeon. In A Link to the Past, if you get a hookshot in a dungeon, you are expected to use that hookshot in that dungeon. If you find a bow and arrow in a dungeon in Zelda 1, you are expected to use it 6 dungeons later, and also you have to buy arrows for it to even be functional. Oh, and you won't even know that you need it until the boss of the dungeon, so you've already invested all this time and you're expected to just leave and find it. And I hope you have enough rupees for the arrows, because grinding for rupees in this game is genuinely awful. That is genuinely the worst type of design. And there is another example of it coming up very shortly. Dungeon 7 is nearby, you just need to know to randomly play this recorder that drained the pond somehow. The dungeon itself isn't anything special, except for halfway through the dungeon you meet this guy. You need to get past him to progress. The only way to get past him is to feed him the meat. You know, that meat that we bought earlier that's just sitting in a random shop that you have no idea why you would ever need. Yeah, it's just a random requirement in one of the late game dungeons for no reason. I quit one of my playthroughs here. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, the item of this place is the red candle, which is one of the most useless items to ever exist. It is literally just the blue candle, but the 1 flame per screen limitation is removed. The problem is that by the time that you get this, you would have very likely already burned all of the bushes that you would have wanted to burn. I assume that this is here to make it a lot more manageable to find Dungeon 8, as it's here. Dungeon 8 is actually pretty good. There's a lot of rooms of blue dark nuts, but by this point in the game, you should be well equipped enough to deal with them. The boss is locked behind a random bombable wall, which always sucks, but the boss itself is just my favorite boss, but with more heads. So yeah, this is my favorite boss in the game, even if I do die to it a lot of the time. I honestly feel like the placement of Dungeon 8 is actually super well thought out. Coming out of Dungeon 7, you have the opportunity to buy a potion, which you would really want for Dungeon 9. However, Dungeon 8 is pretty hard, so it's going to tempt players to use that potion just to get by. This is where the location comes into play. Dungeon 8 is actually located pretty close to a fairy fountain, so instead of using your potions to get full health, you could exit the dungeon and make a short trip to the fairy fountain, effectively saving your potion. It's just really thoughtful placement. Ugh, but now it's time for Dungeon 9, which is on this screen. I knew it was on this screen! I did not know where to bomb! I guess not even returning players are safe from this. I hate the final dungeon. It feels like this place is specifically made to just waste all your keys. Because of that, while I would normally recommend just using a normal map of the dungeon, for this dungeon, I would honestly recommend using this map from Zelda Dungeon that gives you the exact route through the entire dungeon, because wasting keys is just not fun here. The dungeon item is the red ring, which is an item that increases your defense again. It's really welcome here, but I just wish that you got it a bit earlier so it got more use. This is a trend that actually kind of continues in future games. The final boss is, of course, Ganon, except he is invisible and constantly teleports around the room. You gotta guess where he is, and then strike. This gimmick is fine, I guess. It makes the Ganon fight a little bit more memorable, but I'm gonna be honest, striking around thin air hoping to hit the pigman is not exactly fun. And to actually finish him off, you need to use an item. What item? Well, the bow and arrow. Except no, I lied, because it's not the bow and arrow, it's the bow and silver arrows. This dungeon's second dungeon item that you just need to know to look for. You know, despite every single past dungeon only having 1 dungeon item max, and there being a very real possibility that you collected the red ring thinking that it was the only dungeon item, because why would you expect 2 when there's been 1 in every single dungeon? And you're just stuck there guessing as to why you can't kill Ganon? Because you don't have the item that you didn't expect to even exist? Yeah, this is pretty stupid. Look at the amount of times that you couldn't figure out what to do in this game. Now, maybe you decided that I've been too harsh in that I counted things that I shouldn't have. So you know what? Let's arbitrarily just cut this number in half. That is still way too much. Every single time something like this happens in a game, it completely breaks immersion. Zelda 1 is a really hard game to judge. At the time that it came out, there was absolutely nothing better. It was peak. It was S tier without question. And if you've already played through the game a few times, then that number means nothing to you. because you already know where everything is. It doesn't matter that it's BS to figure it out, you already know. And thus, the enjoyment of the game goes up drastically. If I was judging this from the perspective of my third or fourth playthrough, I would honestly say that it's a B tier game. But I just can't bring myself to judge a game like that. I would never, not in a million years, recommend somebody to play Zelda 1 without a guide. Because I feel like playing Zelda 1 without a guide is genuinely one of the worst gaming experiences you could put yourself through. D tier.